Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. Today's episode is different than any episode I've done this season because it's just going to be me talking. I decided it was time for me to actually take a moment to share with you all my own thoughts on this concept of privilege. We've had some amazing conversations in this season so far, and thank you all so much, those of you who've told me what those conversations have sparked, the thoughts and questions and actions in your own life. Thank you so much for that. We've had conversations about race and policing and justice, and conversations about disability and self-care and the way of Jesus, and I'm really, really grateful for all of that. And we're really turning to the second half of the book, White Picket Fences now. I know plenty of you are not following along at home chapter by chapter as I go through these different topics with guests on this podcast. But for me, White Picket Fences as a book has provided the framework for the conversations that I want to have. And so when I had chapters in the book about my early childhood, I talked to other people who could speak to the reality of racism from multiple perspectives. When I had a chapter in the book about receiving my child with Down syndrome as a gift, I talked to another mom who has a child with Down syndrome. And so it's guided the way I've gone through this. Most recently, we're at the midpoint of the book, White Picket Fences. And we're turning towards some conversations actually about disability again. So the month of October will have, it coincides nicely actually because October is Down Syndrome Awareness Month. And so we'll be interviewing some people with Down syndrome and those who are related and have been affected by people with Down syndrome. And we're going to be talking also, of course, about the upcoming presidential election. So there's a lot ahead, but I wanted to pause today and give you some thoughts on what privilege is, what it is not, and why we are even bothering to talk about it. Why we open the doors on this, why we look at this problem of social divisions within our nation and within our own lives and our own communities. And I'll give you a hint. The reason we do that is so that we can participate in healing. So thanks for being here with me today, and I am now going to do what I do when I'm invited to speak in front of groups and talk about privilege. So I would think that many of you who are here listening know my story, but just as a really quick run through my life, I did grow up in Edenton, North Carolina, a small southern town on the coast of North Carolina. But I grew up with parents who came from Connecticut. So I was a little bit of a Yankee in North Carolina, even though I had a thick enough accent that my husband says if we listen back to home videos of that time, you can't understand what I was saying. It was a really happy childhood. I loved my neighbors. I loved my school. I loved my town. I felt really proud of living in this small town in North Carolina. There was a lot of safety and stability in my life. As I write about in White Picket Fences, there were 3 African American people who actually worked in our home, and I felt loved and cared for by them, as well as by the old ladies who lived on our block and the men and women in every sector of my life. I moved to Connecticut when I was 10 years old and started reflecting then about that time in North Carolina and the racial and socioeconomic dynamics that continued really for the rest of my life. And I went on to boarding school. I went on to college. I got a job right out of college working in a parachurch ministry, and I married my high school sweetheart. So that worked out well. I still really like him, and it is 21 years later. So that's been quite a blessing in my life. But it also meant that I had this life that just went pretty well. Now, I say all that, and those of you who've read White Picket Fences know that I also had like a severe eating disorder in the midst of it, and as an adult have certainly struggled with some not clinical, but kind of run-of-the-mill anxiety and sadness and loneliness and seasons of just drinking too much wine and all sorts of problems. But that said, looking in from the outside, my life was going pretty well, and I was on a track of achievement, efficiency, and success. 5 years into my marriage with Peter, I was pregnant with our first child, and our daughter Penny, who of course you have heard me speak about before, was born on December 30th, 2005. She was born into all of these social advantages that I had. She had whiteness, she had wealth, she had educated married parents, so all of that safety and stability. Penny also was diagnosed with Down syndrome as soon as she was born, and as a result, she was born into a history of exclusion and discrimination within our country. She had been born into a set of social advantages. She also had been born into a set of social disadvantages that I had not personally experienced before. I tell you this because her story has shaped my story. Her experiences and our experiences as a family have shaped how we see not only people with disabilities, but also all sorts of other people who are on the margins and who, over the course of the history of this nation and over the course of just human life, have been pushed to the margins and pushed out of opportunities and advantages that I just found myself born right into. I share all that as a preamble to a conversation about this word, privilege. It's a word that has been used a lot more in recent years. I don't remember ever talking about privilege other than it's a privilege to meet you when I was younger. And what I want to try to do is to talk about what privilege is, what it is not, how it harms everyone, and how we can participate in healing. I know the word can be kind of like a trigger for shame, for anger. It can really make people just shut down and be like, I don't want to be a part of this conversation. If you're going to point your fingers at me, I'm not pointing fingers. Okay. And if I am, my gosh, I'm pointing it at myself. I'm wanting to take a hard look at my life in such a way, not that I can go hide in a corner and feel bad about the unearned gifts and opportunities I was given, but rather to reckon with them, to acknowledge the ways that they have caused harm in my life and in the lives of other people, but also to recognize the ways in which they've given me things that I can bring to participate in healing within our society. So let's start with what privilege is. It began as just a legal term, a legal right that is given to one group and not to another. So if you think about voting rights and you go back to the history of our nation, the privilege of voting was initially offered to land-owning white men. And I don't need to go through all of the history in order to make it clear that that privilege is something that has expanded over time. And it's still something that in legal terms, we actually debate in our country who should have the privilege of voting. People over 18, people who are citizens, both men and women, people of all different races and ethnicities, as long as they meet those other criteria, right? But what about someone who has spent time in prison? Should they be given the privilege of voting? There are lots of questions still about that, but that helps explain what that word privilege means in its legal context. Over time, we started using the word privilege not simply to mean legal advantages, but also social advantages. And we've started to see that there are sets of social advantages that are unearned and that are given by society at large to some people and not to others. And that's how I think about privilege. That's how I talk about privilege, as a set of unearned social advantages. So now I want you to call forth in your mind Venn diagrams, all right? Because privilege is like a Venn diagram where there are overlapping circles of social advantage. And there are different identifying markers within our society that confer social advantage on some people and not others. And yes, whiteness is one of them. I'm going to come back to that. We hear this term white privilege, but that's not all that privilege is reduced to. But there are other ways to experience privilege. So there's socioeconomic privilege. There's the privilege, unearned advantage of having parents who are married, who are educated. There are privileges that come with being male, with being heterosexual, and on down a whole list of different identifying markers within our society. And of course, privileges can change from one society to the next. But I'm talking about Western, North American, United States, our society. But I do want to point out that some of the guests I've even had on this podcast have talked about the privileges as women of color that they have had in their lives. So my friend Nero Feliciano, who's a psychotherapist and is the child of immigrants from Sri Lanka, talked on this show about the privilege of being born into married, affluent, educated parents, but also the disadvantages that she experienced as a woman of color. She didn't talk at great length about this, but she certainly experienced discrimination at the school that we went to for boarding school. My friend Subira Gordon, who also gave an awesome interview on this podcast about educational inequities in Connecticut, would say that she, as a Black woman, had the privilege to be in predominantly white spaces for a lot of her educational life, and that many, many other people do not have that advantage. So these are both just examples of people who would say, yes, I'm not white, and I have privilege. And I have some privilege that some white people do not have. So we're not only talking about whiteness when we're talking about privilege. And I do want to make that really clear as we go. That said, whiteness does confer privilege if we're talking about unearned social advantages. And there are studies upon studies that show this. So I'm going to just give a couple of examples. When people apply for jobs, if their qualifications are identical, but their name indicates that they probably come from an African American cultural background, as opposed to a white-sounding name from a white-sounding cultural background, the people who come presumably from that African American background are half as likely to get a callback as the applicant with the white-sounding name. So that's an example of unearned social advantage, the name that has been given to you, giving you an advantage in a job interview. So even when you control for factors like college degrees, educational attainment, etc., white people get paid more than people of color. Again, unearned social advantage is conferred upon whiteness. I'll give one more example. I heard this actually in a TED radio hour, that people who are given pictures of two athletes, one white and one black, and the athletes' credentials are listed identically, people rate the anonymous white athlete as being higher in intelligence than the anonymous black athlete, even though they have the same information about those two players. So these are just small examples of the ways in which whiteness confers privilege, confers unearned social advantages. And of course, those advantages have consequences that are legal and legislative and social in nature. There are disparities for all sorts of people in our nation. It's not just about being black or white. And I'm not going to go into all of those details here because I think for those of you who have listened to this podcast long enough, you'll know that you can think through, what does it mean to have been given unearned social advantages? What are the concentric circles that overlap in that Venn diagram? Where do I fall in the midst of that? How has that played out in my life, in my community? And those are questions I would certainly encourage you to ask. But I also want to talk about and be really clear on what privilege is not. As I have traveled around the country and talked with people about this topic, there are three things that have come up. People feel like when I say the word privilege, I am making an accusation that they are guilty of something. People feel like I am making an accusation that they are not working hard. And people feel like I'm making an accusation that they've had an easy life with no suffering. And none of those things are true. So let me say it again. Privilege is not an accusation of guilt. It is not an accusation of not working hard. And is not an accusation of having had an easy life. I want to explain that a little bit more. I remember being in Raleigh, North Carolina, when a white man was listening to me speak alongside a black man. And he said, there are times when I just want to walk out the house in the morning and put a paper bag over my head. I feel so much shame and guilt in being a white man in Raleigh, North Carolina, knowing that what white men have stood for in this city has not often been good for other people. it's really important that all of us understand what it means to be who we are, and especially for Christians, to consider what it means to be made in God's image as who we are, and that certainly includes white men. And so for this man to be affirmed in being a man, being white, and saying, what does it mean for me to reckon with who I am and to use that for good? My friend Natasha Sistrunk Robinson, who again has been interviewed on this podcast, has written before, your guilt doesn't help anyone. Actually, she didn't write that. She said that on the podcast. Your guilt doesn't help anyone. But if you can recognize the ways in which your privilege has advantaged you in this world, then you can use that privilege to help lots of people, including yourself. So privilege is not an accusation of guilt. Privilege is not also an accusation of not working hard. Most privileged people work really hard. We have a value of achievement in privileged circles. We see that with something like the college admissions scandal of a couple of years ago, where you have all these parents who already have wealth and already have status and already have whiteness and already have all of these things. Nevertheless, paying more money and working harder to get their kids into college because they think their life is going to be a disaster if they don't have that. There is a sense of people in these circles of whiteness and wealth and education and attainment of working really, really, really hard. It actually can be a really distorted value. I became most aware of this, however, that hard work is not what confers the advantages. Hard work is not the only thing, at least, that gets you ahead. And I came to see that. I remember this moment really early on in Penny's life when she was doing physical therapy and she was working so hard, groaning and grunting and trying again and again and again to reach a toy. And she couldn't do it. And it just was this moment of recognition for me that what other babies were just given in their bodies, in their eyes, in their brains, she had not been given. And she was going to have to work harder and receive less. It helped me to see that, yeah, hard work is important. I want to teach that to all my kids. I think it's a great value. But working hard is not what gives us the advantages that we have in our culture, because so many of them are unearned and are given to us by our culture. The final thing I will say about privilege and what it is not is that it's not a guarantee of an easy life, and it's not an accusation of an easy life. There was a reader of White Picket Fences who I really appreciated. Early on, she wrote me and she said, I'm now starting to see the difference between being privileged and feeling privileged. She was a white woman who, again, had grown up like me in a house with married, educated parents who were able to provide for her to go to college and provide all sorts of material goods and possessions. And yet she also was growing up in a household where her parents were on the brink of divorce and her sister had gone to a rehab facility for an eating disorder, and things felt awful at home. She did not feel privileged to be a part of her family, and yet being a part of her family did confer unearned social advantages upon her that really did offer opportunities for her to get out of that destructive home later on in her life. So this brings me back, having talked about what privilege is not, to my working definition of privilege. I mentioned earlier a set of unearned social advantages, and that is the beginning of how I think about privilege, a set of unearned social advantages. But I'm going to add a second clause. I believe that privilege is a set of unearned social advantages that lead to unjust social divisions and disparities. And here's why. Unearned social divisions, it could be that I get something that I don't earn, and my automatic response is, well, I better share this with other people because I didn't earn it. But that isn't how humans as individuals or as groups tend to work. What we tend to do is to find ways to convince ourselves that we did earn it, and even if we're a little bit aware that we didn't earn it, to still try to think about how we can keep it for ourselves because we are scared of losing it. And so what happens over time is that we build systems that exclude and that cut us off from one another and that perpetuate those advantages in such a way that it can cause great harm. There's the harm of exclusion, and we see that in our society. We see that in these very small ways, whether it's the exclusion of, I remember my daughter Penny when she was 2 years old being told she would not be eligible for preschool because she had Down syndrome, right? That's just this like kind of minor experience of exclusion. The experiences of exclusion that, again, I mentioned my friend Nero having when she was in high school and recognizing that she was cut off from either social or, in some cases, scholarly opportunities because of the color of her skin. We call some of these things microaggressions, working through the world in such a way that there are these little micro exclusive things that happen throughout the day, throughout the course of our lives. But then, of course, there also is the harm of exclusion that can happen on a much broader level, whether that's the exclusion from a social club or from a school or from a zoned housing area. And all of these things can lead to great disparities between different groups in terms of our health, in terms of our finances, and in terms of our security and safety within our society. The other thing that can happen as unearned social advantages lead to unjust social divisions is that we find ourselves participating in injustice. I feel that way when I look back at my childhood growing up in North Carolina, that I was a part of a system of great disparity socioeconomically and racially in our town. I went to a school, as I've talked about here before, that was founded as a result of the desegregation of schools. So I went to an all-white school, and I loved that school, but I also participated in a system of injustice. This is not just something that happens in the South or something that happens in the past. I've been learning recently about systems that have been perpetuated here in Connecticut when it comes to housing. Many of the towns in Connecticut have zoning laws that effectively make sure that people from different socioeconomic classes cannot move into town because you can only build a single family or buy a single family dwelling on a large parcel of land. And so when you can't have small and multi-family dwellings within a town, what does that do? It means that people who have less money, even if they're hard workers, can't live there. It means they can't have access to the schools and other opportunities available within that town and that community. People who are in that position are disproportionately not white. So it also perpetuates racial and ethnic divisions. So zoning laws and housing laws and mortgage financing here in Connecticut is another way in which I personally participate in injustice. So there's the harm of exclusion, there's participation in injustice, and then finally there are these what I call harmful benefits of privilege. I've said this before, but I'll mention it again, that if you look at white, affluent, educated populations, they have high rates, both among adolescents and adults, of substance abuse, high rates of anxiety, high rates of depression. Again, the college admissions scandal gives a little zoomed in window on the degree of distortion when it comes to achievement that can happen in those communities. So you have all the benefits, all the advantages, and there's a desperate sense of needing to work for more. So when Penny first came into our family, I became aware first of this harm of exclusion, recognizing the ways that she and other people in marginalized groups were cut off from the advantages that I had by no fault of their own. But I also began to see the harm of homogeneity, the harm of living in a culture of achievement and efficiency, a culture that values productivity over people and the intellect over relationships and the individual over community. I began to see that I lived in a world of isolated achievement instead of mutual giving and receiving. I lived in a world of competition instead of compassion, invincibility instead of vulnerability. I lived in a world of control rather than love. And I don't mean to say that people who have Down syndrome or people who live on the margins more broadly are idyllic humanity. What I really just mean to say is that privilege harms everyone. The ways we are cut off from one another and from the full expression of human diversity is not only unjust, but it is also harmful. And I, for one, want to be a part of healing. So I want to acknowledge the harm that I've been a part of, the harm that I've experienced, the harm that I've participated in, so that I can see it more clearly and begin to participate in healing. I wrote a couple weeks ago on my blog about traditional responses to the harm of social division and the ways in which the different responses that we've given over the years as a society are good, but inadequate and haven't worked. And I will just run through those right here, and we'll note in the show notes that blog post if you would like to look. The first response has been noblesse oblige, which is a French term that means nobility obligates. And essentially, privilege obligates. If you are a person of privilege, then you are obligated to help other people. And I mean, certainly helping other people is a good thing. Figuring out what it means to share what you've got is a great idea. But some of the problems that come up with this is that there's no structural change. Charitable acts of both time and money do not create structural change in the way a society functions. They also can perpetuate power dynamics in which the person who is the giver stays removed and in power, and the person who is the receiver is meant to simply sit back and be grateful. So there's no structural change, and it can be one-sided, and that perpetuates the status quo. Activism is another response to these problems of social division. And those activists often do a great job of addressing systems of injustice, of recognizing that there are economic and social systems at work that need to be changed, rethought, reimagined. But of course, as we've seen in recent months and years here in America, these activist causes can be really polarizing, can be really totalizing. There can be a lack of grace and a sense of if everyone just became perfect like me, then we'd be okay. And there can be an us versus them. So there's lots of truth-telling, I believe, within activism. And I think we really need that to work in our culture. And yet, if we can't have grace, if we can't have listening, and if we can't have a recognition that seismic change often brings with it seismic destruction, whereas incremental change allows us to anticipate unintended consequences in time and make slow but steady adjustments towards a better outcome for the common good and for many people, that can be a real disadvantage of activism, that sense of polarizing and idealistic movement. I hope that makes sense. And the final thing that has happened, I think, in our culture is assimilation, where people who are in positions of power, which again tends to be some concentric overlap of white, wealthy, educated, affluent, say, hey, you're welcomed to come and be like me. You're welcomed into this space, but you need to become like I am. And so again, it maintains a power dynamic and it perpetuates the status quo. So there's some truth in all of these responses, but it's an insufficient truth. This is not a surface problem. This is a deep problem that we are facing as a society. And I believe at its core, it's a spiritual problem that requires a spiritual solution. Yes, policy changes. Yes, charitable giving. Yes, activism. But more than all of that. And this is where I once again want to call forth humble, holistic participation of individuals and institutions in healing that is drawn from a source outside ourselves. Healing that comes from the overflow of the love of God at work in and through God's people. Not just the love of God, but the love of God that is expressed in acts of mercy, of kindness, and of justice. churches and individual and people of faith, not just Christians, have a significant role to play in healing the wounds within our nation and the wounds that have come to all of us as a result of these social hierarchies and these social divisions. The reason I talk about privilege, the reason I talk about unearned social advantages that lead to unjust social divisions is so that we can acknowledge the harm that privilege has caused, reach out to one another, but also reach out to God for help, and then participate in healing. Maybe someday I'll come back on this podcast and give you my healing talk. If you're interested right now, you could go and look up, I have an audio book called Head, Heart, and Hands that talks about the ways in which we can begin to participate in healing. But for now, I'm going to leave it with this sense that we are all invited to understand privilege differently. I want to close with reading a couple of paragraphs from a chapter in White Picket Fences where I begin to think about privilege not in terms of these unearned social advantages, but in terms of what it means to receive the gift of being human. I wrote, "Sometimes I think about privilege in terms of times I have been overcome by gratitude. When I've recognized the undeserved moments of beauty and grace and purpose that connect instead of divide. The list unfurls. The time I swayed with the music in a multicultural worship service. The time I folded sheets and towels for my best friend after her brother died. The time I rocked a friend's newborn baby to sleep. The time I passed out the communion wafers at my grandmother's funeral and was entrusted with the words, 'This is the body of Christ, broken for you.' The privilege of whiteness and wealth can become a wall against the privilege of being human. Loved not for status or performance, but simply loved, and able to give love in return, not because of obligation, but in grateful response to an invitation. I have been given much that I do not deserve, and my very real social privilege has cut me off from others, as much as it has also made my life comfortable. But social privilege is not the end of my story. The real privilege of my life has come in learning what it means to love others, that love involves suffering and sacrifice and sleepless nights and tears and heartache and great gifts. It makes sense to talk about privilege in terms of access to private clubs and schools and bank loans and preferential treatment by authorities. It makes sense to expose the injustices of privilege and call for them to be rectified. But there is also the privilege of cleaning the wounds of people you love, of participating in healing and new life, of becoming vulnerable and needy and receiving love and care. There is another type of privilege that connects instead of divides, that shimmers through the air like a line of light, available if only we stop counting the coins and look up. Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. I know this has been a different episode than what I typically offer, and next week we'll be back with conversation. Got lots of cool people lined up for the rest of this season, including Todd Billings. See, I've got his book here on my desk, and it is called The End of the Christian Life: How Embracing Our Mortality Frees Us to Truly Live. I'm really excited to talk to him. I'm going to be talking with Andy Crouch later on in the season, and hopefully with Jay and Catherine Wolfe. And I'm going to get to talk to Kurt Neal, who is the director of Normie, as well as Anne-Marie Kerrigan, who helped to produce it and also who stars in it. I'm really excited. I've got lots of cool things coming up, and I really hope that you will stick around and get to listen in. I'm also just thankful for the opportunity to send out this podcast into the world. I'm thankful to Breaking Ground, our co-host. Certainly you can look for more great podcast episodes as well as articles and videos and the like over at breakingground.us. I'm really thankful to Jake Hansen for editing and to Amber Beery, who is my social media coordinator and does so much to make this podcast happen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please come back next week. Please share, please rate, please review, all of those things. It would be really helpful. And finally, As you go into your day today, I hope and pray you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.